Our next speaker is no stranger to Hong Kong. Mr. David Stanford is Principal Director of Lee & Orange Limited, a very experienced architect with more than 30 years of experience in Hong Kong and, and elsewhere, with a wide range of projects in Hong Kong, China, and Middle East, including the Union Hospital in Hong Kong. So let's welcome David, who will talk about the trends of healthcare architecture. David, please.
Thank you very much, and good morning. I think each of you may well remember the moment when you first heard the term salutogenesis. Certainly I remember it well, because I first heard the term when Alan Delaney came into our office about 10 weeks ago and gave us an introductory talk. And up until then, I'd never heard the term. But as I listened to his talk and he introduced us to the insights of Professor Antonovsky and how this affected design, it all seemed to me to be very familiar and to have a lot of, things were clicking in my brain and saying, yes, yes. And I was casting back thinking, why is this? And my memory went to a party that our company hosted in September last year. And things began to click from that. And as you'll see from the observant of you will see, we're a very modern go-ahead firm, and I actually have 4 lady partners who work with me. But equally, we're actually quite an old firm. And last year we were celebrating our 140th anniversary. And we celebrated that in a building we designed only about 112 years ago, now called the Fringe Club, but started life as a dairy farm. And this was started by a chap called Granville Sharp. And he wanted to bring fresh milk to Hong Kong. And so in Pok Phalam, he set up a dairy farm. And this cow bar still exists and may have been designed by a firm, we're not quite sure. And then after a couple of years, he decided he needed somewhere to sell his milk and cheese. And so he commissioned our firm to build the dairy farm in Central. And this contained cold stores and also a shop behind these doors and windows that you can see where people could buy fresh milk in hot Hong Kong. And also in the cold stores, people could also store their fur coats over the summer period, so they were fresh for winter. And in fact, Granville Sharp was one of the founders of our firm. So our firm started 140 years ago as Sharp and Danby. And then in 1894, it became Lee & Orange. And Granville Sharp came with his wife Matilda to Hong Kong in the 1850s. Sadly, his wife died in 1894, and Granville Sharp himself died in about 1901. And in his will, he left a large sum of money to found a hospital in Hong Kong for the benefit, care, and happiness of the patient, as this was expressed in the will. And that hospital actually exists today, and it's called Matilda Hospital after his wife, and that's on the Peak in Hong Kong. And so since then, we've gradually developed our body of work in Hong Kong, building many landmark buildings. Until now, we're a very wide-ranging practice. And at the same time, we've had our own practice in healthcare. One of the buildings we did back in the 1990s was to build Union Hospital, as was mentioned in the introduction. And this was an 8-story building with about 200 beds and an outpatients department and a couple of operating theatres. And then 10 years ago, which you can see here, and then 10 years ago, the client decided he wanted to extend it by 4 stories. So you'd get more beds in, and you'd have bigger throughput through the operating theatre. And so we'd actually designed the building to be extended by 2 stories, so we had to make everything very light in order to get up to 4 stories. And then we also had to work through all the practicalities of extending an operating hospital. So in effect, we had to maintain the health and welfare of all the patients in the existing hospital while we built 4 floors on top. So we had to think about lifts, we had to think about plant, we had to think about everything and keep it all operating. And so this got transformed to this. And at the same time, we also updated and brought up to date all the internal spaces of the hospital and made them, before we'd even discovered the term, I hope, much more friendly towards the patients and much more health-giving. And I think one of the marvels of this hospital, and if you ever go to the hospital, demand that you get a hillside-facing room. Because in the afternoon, the sun shines on the hillside. You're looking at it from shade, and that hillside bursts into the room. And on the left-hand side, you can just see it happening behind the lace curtains. Those lace curtains should be pulled back, because it really, really is a fantastic environment. We also designed a very nice restaurant on the deck at the back, which is also a very restful and intriguing space. So, Union Hospital was very famous, actually, for babies. This is where a lot of mainlanders came to have their children born. It stopped a couple of years ago when the government changed its policies. But also, we looked at aging gracefully. So a while ago, we also designed what's delightfully called Jolly Place, which is basically what in the UK would be called courtyard housing. But here, we don't have the full courtyard. And so basically, it's sheltered housing, very well-designed flats. It also has a series of communal facilities, a garden, and also facilities for the residents, like a gym and a common area. It also has a hydrotherapy pool, and it also has the concept of aging in place. So you can see the flats on the left, and then on the right is the care and attention home. And these are some of the communal facilities: the garden, the hydrotherapy pool, and the main entry. We also, obviously, you have to face the end of life at some point, and we have also worked on hospice care for Haven of Hope Hospital. And here they wanted to convert a building dating from the early 1960s, which was probably built by Sister Annie Skau, who was the founder of Haven of Hope, came from Norway. And it didn't even have a lift. It's 3 stories high, but it didn't even have a lift. So we built this lift. Sorry, excuse me, I'm looking at the next photo along. We built the lift tower, which became the marker for the main entrance. And then nobody knows it's a lift tower, but it looks almost like a clock tower. And it actually brings people in. And then on the inside, we did have to keep it very simple, because the hospital wanted to aim this so that it was very affordable by ordinary people. And so they could actually afford to pay a few $1,000s a month to actually be able to obtain this hospice care for their relatives at the end of their lives. We've also recently worked on a proposal for a major extension for a hospital in Futian, just across the border in Shenzhen. Here we took the concept of hospital care and the therapeutic value of nature and vegetation and tried to combine it together into a new sort of hospital, where it's envisioned as a hospital within a park. The existing hospital site is actually at the bottom of this deep green thing, very close to the central park of Shenzhen. And we came up with the concept of a sort of natural leaf encompassing the site. The site is a very complex shape. And one of the things we had to do was to look very carefully at all the surrounding buildings. Because if you're going to do salutogenesis, it can't only be for the people in your buildings, it's got to be for the people around as well. You've got to be thinking about them. And essentially, at the top end of the site, we had to retain an existing medical center. And then we built a new international medical center, which is basically a polite term for a the private aspect of the hospital, and then also a teaching area, which was the International Medical Exchange. And so we had to connect these buildings on a very difficult sort of dogleg site. And we came up with the idea of a linkage which would bring all 3 buildings together and give legibility and order to the building, so that people could get a sense of coherence as they arrived, and they weren't under stress, because hopefully they could figure out where the main entrance was on this complex building and how to move through the building. And so here you can see the picture on the right. You have the park, then you have the existing building, and then the new tower with the wards, and then behind the teaching building, which is rather smaller. And as you can see here, they're all linked together by a spine, which is the main circulation spine, off which lifts go up into the different towers. And then we sculpted the roofs, so the roofs were actually accessible. The step roof was accessible to people from outside the hospital, and that followed the line of the main circulation spine. And then on top of the circulation spine, there's a roof garden accessible to the patients. We then marked the main entrance by sculpting a hole in the tall building so that you could look from a distance, that should be where I should go, that's the portal. And then at the other end of the building, there's, again, we constructed quite a sculptural opening under the building so residents from the neighborhood could also get into the building and also pass through it and give custom to the retail shops and things like that that are actually in the hospital. And then we wanted to open up the hospital to the landscape environment around it, which is very attractive with the central park. But equally, we had to be polite to the neighbors. And so sunlight studies are very important in China. And when we did the sunlight studies, we discovered we were blocking out light to the neighbors. And so we pushed part of the building down so that the neighboring blocks got enough sunlight. And this is the result here with the existing hospital in front and then behind our new building with the portal marking the entrance, and you can see the landscaping moving up. The functions of the hospital are fairly straightforward. The existing hospital is mostly clinical. The central tower are wards, and then the tower on the left-hand side is for teaching and academic exchange. I think this one may take a while to transition. And so at the bottom of the hospital, we have basically the emergency department at ground level, and that's surrounded by outpatient things, radiology and things like that they need. And then the operating theatres are placed right on the center line of the hospital so that up, down, they're right in the center. Then we also provided a series of conference halls, libraries, bookstores, food and beverage outlets, and other types of stores to give life and also to give people a reason to move through the hospital and to give the main circulation life. And then at the upper level, we have the wards where we have the stepped area, big reception area, where the wards step back. We've got a big reception area for the patients checking in so they can use the roof garden outside. So for access and circulation, as I said, we try to use the hole in the mint, if you like, to mark the entrance, and the ground floor entrance is just off to the right of that. And then here you can see the ground floor entrance with actually the accident and emergency immediately behind. And then the circulation spine is very clearly expressed. And then once you're in the circulation spine, you're actually rising up beside a rising landscape that you can also go out onto, and you're always oriented by the landscape and by the trees. For the detailed design, we got, at the upper level, people would arrive to check into the wards at the transition zone, where we could provide a very generous check-in and also a roof garden and views over the city to the park. And so this is a nice double height space. There's a very discreet glazed check-in at the beginning, and then you can sit down, get oriented, and then gradually get taken off to your ward. And then the ward layouts were a mixture, were carefully developed so that they were easily supervised. And there were two slightly different modes because the client felt he wanted to sort of have what he called a sort of European style of ward and what he called an American style of ward. So we worked with that and produced a central nursing area. Obviously, we thought very carefully about the design of the walls themselves, how natural light would come in through the facade, how we could arrange the walls so they're flexible in terms of the bathroom facilities. So either you could have anything from 5-bed to 2-bed to 1-bed wards, and the layout was such the bathrooms could always be adapted to provide ensuite bathroom facilities. And we also considered how, in a very hot climate like that of Shenzhen, very similar to Hong Kong, how we could modulate the external environment to reduce the heat load on the building. And so we did that by producing operable slats and having a balcony with planting on the outside, as you can see. And then the slats were modified, the number of slats were modified to suit either the north or the south elevation. And you can see the result here, which gives a very lively facade. You can see the idea of the greening behind the facade on the interstitial area between the glazing and the outer slats. So we're nearly there, and I've taken you sort of through perhaps 100-odd years of trends in hospital architecture, and saying in many ways, we've all been aiming at the same thing all this period. But I think the great advantage nowadays is becoming also, there's a great big scientific trend coming into it, which we've seen in the earlier talks even today. And so we've moved from giving birth to looking after people gracefully in their own age, to perhaps a dignified exit, and then to a very major scheme like this, which is trying to do a very large number of things. But I'd like to think if Granville Sharp himself is in heaven and looking down upon us, now we can't be sure he will be in heaven because he did have a reputation for being very sharp in business. But nevertheless, I hope he's looking down upon us and thinking, yes, we've got somewhere. Thank you very much for your time.